For many people around the world, the month of December is a time of togetherness, family, and sentimental happy times. The new year always brings feelings of hope and new beginnings, and sometimes we're all just a little bit nicer to each other. But complacency and poor conditions mean that disasters take no holidays, no matter what the calendar says. It means that a great number of ships have been lost during what should be a month of celebration. From one of history's largest pre-nuclear explosions to one of the worst peacetime losses of life at sea. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and these are the tragedies that have marred the ends of many years. They are the disasters of the festive season. Nowadays in America, it's a tradition for families to go and purchase their yearly Christmas tree from a Christmas tree farm or a pop-up in a lot. But back in the early 20th century, the tradition still existed. It was just very different. In fact, a lot of Christmas tree pop-up shops were right on the decks of sailing ships. These ships carried thousands of trees at a time. For the citizens of Chicago, Illinois, ships would carry trees from northern Michigan and Wisconsin south to the city streets to sell. In 1912, there was an estimated 1 to 2 dozen schooners that were engaged in the Christmas tree trade, so it was a rather competitive field. One of these ships was the Rouse Simmons. The three-masted, 123-foot-long ship carried thousands of trees under the command of Captain Herman Scheunemann. For Captain Scheunemann, the Christmas tree business was a way for him to make some additional income for his family each year. While money may have served as the primary motivation to take part in the trade, Captain Scheunemann had a reputation for kindness and generosity and would give trees away for free to many of Chicago's residents who couldn't afford to buy them otherwise. This earned him the affectionate and delightful nickname of Captain Santa. Navigating the Great Lakes during winter was no easy task. Most other ships in the area were laid up in the winter months instead, but Captain Scheunemann was an experienced captain and had been transporting Christmas trees to Chicago for nearly 30 years, and he was confident in his abilities. He also calculated that with less ships willing to navigate these harsh conditions, there'd be less competition for him amongst the citizens of Chicago. He was having financial problems at the time, and he knew with less availability of Christmas trees, he'd stand to make a larger profit than normal. So the captain took the Rouse Simmons up the northern part of Lake Michigan to pick up a load of trees. Now, the estimated number of trees loaded aboard ranges from anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000, with some estimates saying closer to 5,500. Now, regardless of the exact number, the fact of the matter is, the ship was probably overloaded. Reportedly, Christmas trees were stuffed into every corner of the ship, both below and above deck. The Rouse Simmons departed south on a route down the length of Lake Michigan to Chicago, a distance of approximately 300 miles, on November 22, 1912. The ship did not arrive on the expected date, nor any of the subsequent days. One day after their departure, on November 23rd, the Rescue Kewaunee Life-Saving Station spotted the Rouse Simmons with tattered sails, sitting low in the water and flying her flags at half-mast, signalling distress. The station's rescue boat was already in use, so they phoned the nearest other station. That station sent a powerboat on a rescue mission, attempting to cut the Rouse Simmons off on their anticipated route, but the ship was never seen again. A few weeks later, there were very ominous signs of the Rouse Simmons' fate when Christmas trees began washing up on shore along the western side of the lake. That was the only sign of the missing ship until 12 years later, when Captain Scheunemann's oilskin-wrapped wallet was found in a fishing net. That was the last bit of evidence until 1971, when the wreck of the Rouse Simmons was finally discovered by a scuba diver who was actually out to look for a different lost steamer. She's lying 12 miles northeast of Two Rivers, Wisconsin, at about 165 feet of water. In the years and decades since the initial wreck discovery, the site's been documented and studied by Wisconsin state archaeologists in an attempt to piece together her final moments. The ship's lying with her bow pointing to the northwest, towards the shore, not south, as was her intended sailing direction. Her anchor gear, the chain and windlass and the tools were all found on the deck at the bow, seemingly ready to deploy. 170 feet north of the wreck lies the anchor itself. Now, the most likely scenario seems that the Rouse Simmons deployed her anchor to hold her steady in the fierce winter wind, and then large waves would have crashed down on the decks of the ship, ultimately sending her to the bottom of the lake. 17 people, including Captain Scheunemann, were lost when their ship sank out from under them. For those who live in the southern hemisphere, like Australians like me, December is usually a warm and mild month before summer really kicks off. But for those who live up north in the other half of the world, it's quite a cold and blustery season, especially in the world's oceans where conditions can absolutely rage. And so it was in December of 1978 that the crew of the German ship MS München were subjected to some of the fiercest weather imaginable. MS München was a technological marvel of her time. She was one of the biggest, most modern cargo ships in the world, 261 metres or 856 feet long, fitted with a 26,000 horsepower engine, and one of the most advanced navigational systems and the newest safety equipment. She had proven her seaworthiness several times over, having completed 61 journeys already, repeatedly making it out of strong storms unharmed. The München left Bremerhaven in the direction of Savannah, Georgia on December 7th, 1978. She had a crew of about 28 people. The ship was loaded with 83 barges, carrying around 25,000 tons of cargo, mainly steel. 5 days later, on December 12th, north of the Azores, the München ran into a storm. The storm was immense, referred to by a British weather station as the hurricane of the century. Wind speeds reached over 150 kilometers per hour, that's 90 miles per hour. The waves reached over 50 feet in height. The sheer size of the storm meant it was completely impossible to avoid. Radio operator Jorg Ernst reported, "We've got bad weather, the bridge is damaged, the portholes are bashed in, but no further concerns." Things, though, would take a turn for the worst in a hurry. At 3:10 a.m, just 3 hours later, the München made a distress call. The radio operator of the Greek freighter Marion received a barely audible emergency call, SOS, 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 and that was the last anyone heard from the München. Despite the horrendous weather conditions, there was an all-out effort to rescue the crew of the ship. 13 planes and 110 vessels from many different nations combed through an area 5 times the size of Germany. 3 life rafts were found in the recovery efforts. A few days later, on December 17th, an emergency buoy was discovered along with a few life jackets and a 4th raft. 3 days later, the rescue operation was called off entirely, although the Western German government continued searching for a few more days. Eventually, a single lifeboat was found floating, encrusted in barnacles, and badly damaged. The München is thought to have sunk about 30 minutes after its emergency distress call was sent out. The most likely cause of her sinking was one or more rogue waves. There were no survivors, and to this day, her wreck has never been found. Occasionally, a disaster happens that is just so monumental in its scale, it's honestly kind of difficult to even wrap your head around. And this is one of them, when a passenger ferry collided with an oil tanker in a disaster that resulted in the loss of hundreds of lives. The MV Doña Paz was originally built as a Japanese ferry in 1962 before she was sold to the Philippine-based Sulpicio Lines and converted for use on the busy inter-island services there. Almost from the start, the ship was notorious for her poor safety standards. It all came to a head on the night of December 20th, 1987, when the Doña Paz was sailing from Leyte Island to the Philippine capital of Manila. Conditions were moderate, but dangerously, the ferry was seriously overcrowded. This was because of the Christmas rush, as many were heading home for the holidays. It resulted in maybe over 1,000 more people than had actually been recorded as fare-paying passengers. Unfortunately, overcrowding the ship was not a new practice for Sulpicio Lines, as they were known to have done it before. Doña Paz was hardly in good condition either. Some reports even stated the ship didn't have a working radio. Motoring nearby that night was the tanker Vector, carrying a monumental volume of gasoline. Later investigations revealed that none of Doña Paz's senior crew were on station. Only a lone apprentice was keeping watch on the ship's bridge, while the other officers were drinking beer, relaxing in their mess room and watching films. The overcrowded ferry was essentially sailing with her eyes shut. Then, the inevitable happened, and the two ships collided. The heavy impact caused sparks to dart out and ignite a raging blaze, and it very quickly spread across to the Doña Paz. Most of the ferry's passengers were asleep at the time of the collision, and escape routes were very quickly cut off. The power died, and a blackout made it nearly impossible for the panicked crowds to pick their way through the labyrinthine corridors and find their life jackets or their muster stations. It was a perfect storm of issues that would take the lives of hundreds. The crew was just as panicked. They gave no guidance whatsoever, and passengers had to decide to stay aboard the engulfed vessel or jump into the flaming waters that now surrounded the ship. The horrible scene looked like something out of Dante's Inferno. Eventually, a passing ferry was able to arrive on station and render aid, but the scene was horrendous. Passengers were plucked from the water, many of them badly burned, after having clung to anything that would float. Within 4 hours, both of the ships had sunk, leaving behind a flaming oil slick that burned into the morning. The youngest survivor was a 4-year-old boy. He was miraculously discovered adrift on a piece of lumber, placed there by his father a full 2 days later. Ultimately, the estimated death toll for the incident is over 4,000 people, with only 27 survivors. It supplanted Titanic in scale and remains the deadliest peacetime marine disaster in history. The death toll was absolutely stunning, and it shook the Philippines to its core. It's thought that nearly 80 public school teachers were lost, and a list of 2,000 missing people was published in a daily newspaper. An inquiry was immediately launched and found several disturbing facts: that the crew had been distracted from their duties, even partying on the bridge. The Philippine maritime authorities proved lacking, having arrived only 8 hours after the collision and then launching a full-hearted search and rescue another 8 hours after that. But despite the bizarre behaviour of Doña Paz's crew, the Supreme Court of the Philippines ruled it was the owners of the Vector who were most liable. Shockingly, it was revealed that Vector was even more unseaworthy than the Doña Paz, but most disturbing of all, her captain had no official qualifications. In the end, a report blamed the unqualified crew, the archaic communications systems, and a horribly overloaded ferry. Sulpicio Line lost another 3 ships into the 1990s in typhoons, with hundreds killed. In June 2024, the company, since renamed, was found liable for the deaths of hundreds of people on their ship Princess of the Stars, and it's been ordered to pay around $2 million to the family members. That's a paltry $1,675 per person lost. The loss of the Doña Paz is devastating because of the sheer number of human lives that were taken. This next disaster is awe-inspiring, not just because of the scale of human suffering, but because of the sheer magnitude of the destruction that was wrought when 2 ships collided, and one of them was packed full of ammunition and explosives. On the morning of December 6, 1917, the steamship Mont Blanc, inbound from the Atlantic Ocean, entered the Halifax Harbour Narrows. The Norwegian ship Emo, meanwhile, was leaving Bedford Basin outbound for New York to load supplies for occupied Belgium. Halifax at that time was a critical location for the Allied efforts of the First World War. The Narrows shoreline was shaped by rail lines connecting shipping terminals to the mainland. Residents in the communities of Richmond and Africville depended on this railway, the factories, and the waterfront. The port was the closest to Europe in North America, so when the fighting broke out, it was immensely important. The city's rail and shipping facilities were quickly integrated to support the war. Hundreds of thousands of service personnel departed from the deepwater terminals to the battlefields of Europe. Famously, Titanic's sister Olympic made 10 round trips between Liverpool and Halifax in 1916. Halifax was as fully integrated with the war as any North American city could possibly be. The main cargo on the ship Mont Blanc was high explosives. She was sailing under the orders from the French government to carry her cargo from New York City via Halifax to Bordeaux in France. She was moving slow, approximately just 1 knot. Now approaching her was the Emo. Between the 2 ships, there was a series of miscommunications on which way each would pass, and then a series of bad maneuvers. The Emo collided with the Mont Blanc's starboard bow, and while the impact was at a slow speed, it was enough to spill the barrels of Benzoyl that were being stored on the deck. Vapors spewed into the air, and they were ignited by sparks from the collision. A fire broke out and spread across the ship and grew out of control. 20 minutes later, barrels of petrochemical triggered a blast, and the Mont Blanc erupted. The ship had been turned into a 3-kiloton bomb sitting right in the middle of a busy port. At the time, it was the largest man-made explosion of all time, and the damage was immense. Vaporized fuel and chemicals shot into the sky and fell down on people like rain, leaving them covered in an oily film. Pieces of the destroyed steamship fell across an 8-kilometre or nearly 5-mile radius. Nearly every structure within an 800-metre or half-mile radius was obliterated. This included the entire community of Richmond. The pressure wave created from the explosion snapped trees, bent iron rails, demolished buildings, and even grounded vessels. The Emo itself was washed ashore by an ensuing tsunami. The same tsunami wiped out an indigenous community that had lived at Tufts Cove for generations. The explosion immediately cut off communications between North America, Nova Scotia, and the world overseas. Roadways, telegraphs, phone lines, and submarine cables were also all disrupted by the blast. One of the common injuries was from glass. People had been watching the collision and fire unfold from behind their windows, and when the explosion came suddenly, it shattered those windows all across the city. People in the surrounding areas sprung into action immediately to provide first aid relief. Many first responders were soldiers and sailors from Canada, the UK, and the United States on ships docked in port. In the years following the explosion, there were several legal battles on where to pin the blame. In an early judicial inquiry, which had been heavily influenced by lawyers representing the owners of the Emo, blame was put on 3 men: the Mont Blanc's captain, the harbour pilot aboard Mont Blanc, and the naval officer in command of the entire harbour. Despite evident fault lying with both vessels, the judge in Nova Scotia presiding over the inquiry found the Mont Blanc solely at fault for the disaster in a ruling on February 4th, 1918. The 3 men were arrested and charged with manslaughter. There were several attempts to prosecute them for their convictions, but the charges were ultimately dropped thanks to a lack of evidence. Eventually, logic found its way into the court system when the Supreme Court of Canada declared that both the Mont Blanc and the Emo were equally to blame. Although, in an injustice to the victims and people who lost their loved ones that day, no one was ever successfully prosecuted for their failures leading to the explosion. At least 1,782 people died that day, many of them residents of Halifax and neighbouring Dartmouth, by the actual explosion, falling debris, resulting fires, or collapsed buildings, and an estimated 9,000 people were injured. Lives lost at sea are always tragic, but there's something about shipwrecks near the holiday season that makes them that much more heartbreaking. People should be around their loved ones at this time, not living through the most harrowing ordeals imaginable. Sadly, these 5 stories remind us that disasters don't run to any calendar. So, this festive season, if you're away from home on the oceans, please, as always, stay safe and stay happy. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.